The black equipment case had been out of Celeste Morgan's hand for less than 5 seconds when my dispatch screen started changing. Ready became manual review. Then another flight changed. Then 6 more. I was standing behind the operations desk at gate D14, monitoring Alder Pacific's live validation session with Marroline systems. Nothing on my screen suggested a software failure. The platform was responding to exactly one event. The registered custody token had been separated from its holder. At the gate reader, Celeste's boarding authorization was still green. First class. Seat 2A. Valid. Martin Crowley was the security supervisor who had taken control of the encounter. He was standing between her and the boarding lane. "Put the case down," Celeste said. Her voice was steady. She was looking at the second security officer holding the case sideways against his vest. Martin gave her a short look. "You're not directing security." I stepped out from behind the desk. "Actually," said it flat. The officer looked at me. I pointed toward the carpet beside the counter. "Don't open it. Don't handle the token again." He lowered the case. More flights changed status on my monitor. A few minutes earlier, none of us had been dealing with an operational emergency. Celeste had entered the priority lane carrying the same case over one shoulder. She wore a dark business suit and no visible company badge. I noticed the case because that morning's flight was part of a scheduled Marroline validation window. Our operations notes included a controlled custody traveler. I did not know that traveler was Celeste. Rebecca Shaw, the gate agent, checked her identification and scanned the boarding pass. Green. The passenger ahead of her had walked through with a roller bag and a garment case without any extra conversation. Martin stopped Celeste. He said there was an irregularity involving her enterprise credential. Rebecca checked her terminal again. It cleared. Martin asked Celeste what was inside the technical case. She said it was company equipment under a custody requirement. "Open it." Celeste looked at him. "Is there a safety concern?" Martin's expression tightened. "I'm conducting secondary verification." Rebecca leaned toward him. "Her reservation has an equipment note." Martin did not ask her to read it. He held out his hand for the case. Celeste kept the handle. "You can verify the notation before separating this from me." That was the point where the conversation changed. Martin stopped treating the case as something that needed checking. He started treating Celeste's refusal as part of the problem. He called it failure to comply. Rebecca tried again. "Operations can confirm the custody instruction." Martin waved over another officer instead. I had started walking toward them. The case was taken from Celeste's hand. The electronic chirp came almost immediately. Now my screen showed departures entering manual review across the network. Not cancellations. Not grounded aircraft. The safeguard had suspended automated release for flights still dependent on the active validation session. We needed to establish whether the custody token had been compromised. I keyed the operations phone. "Control, this is D14. We have an unexpected holder separation event during the Marroline session." Martin turned toward me. "This is a local security issue." It was until the token separated. Rebecca was already looking at her gate screen. "Brian." I turned. A security note had appeared beneath Celeste's passenger record. "Priority credential irregularity. Technical equipment unresolved. Boarding pending security review." Rebecca looked at Martin. She already scanned as valid. Martin folded his arms. She refused secondary instructions. Celeste did not answer him. She had taken out her phone. For a second, I thought she was documenting the encounter. Then, I saw the message on the screen because I was standing beside her. "Front row. You promised." Celeste read it once and locked the phone. That was the first time her expression changed. Not much. Just enough for me to understand that the delay had already reached something outside this gate. Martin told Rebecca to deny boarding until security completed its review. I looked at the case on the floor, then at the network count climbing on my console. There was another problem. We can't complete recovery without the registered holder. Martin looked at Celeste. "She can leave the secure area after we process the denial." "No," I said. "If she's the registered custodian, she stays with the equipment until we verify the separation." For the first time that morning, security and operations were no longer pushing in the same direction. I moved the recovery process to our logged operations room behind D16. Before leaving the gate, I submitted the network impact packet required whenever a validation event affected multiple departures. The system routed one copy to central operations. A second copy went automatically to airline security compliance. Martin was still explaining that Celeste had caused the disruption. The record leaving my terminal showed something more specific. Security had separated controlled equipment from its registered holder, and that version was already outside the gate. The first thing Heather Sloan checked in the operations room was whether anyone had opened the case. Nobody had. She placed it on the inspection table and confirmed the exterior seal. She connected the custody reader without touching the internal hardware. I stood at the continuity console beside her, while Celeste Morgan remained on the opposite side of the table. Martin Crowley stayed near the door. The network count had stopped climbing. 206 departures were now in manual review. Heather opened the token status. Separation event confirmed. No unauthorized challenge attempts. Martin looked toward Celeste. So the system reacted because she refused to cooperate. I turned from my screen. That isn't what the event says. He looked at me. I pulled up the sequence attached to the network impact packet. The token separated when security took possession of the case. Martin's face tightened. She could have prevented that by following instructions. Celeste did not argue with him. She looked at Heather instead. Can you verify the holder relationship without opening the case? Yes. Then do that first. Heather reached for the morning custody packet. Rebecca Shaw entered a moment later carrying a printed operations manifest from the gate. I found the equipment notation. She placed it beside Heather's keyboard. The document had been distributed before the first departure bank that morning. It listed the Line validation session, the controlled case requirement, and one handling instruction in plain language. Do not separate registered holder from validation equipment without documented override condition. Below it was the security acknowledgement section. Martin Crowley's initials were there. Nobody needed to reconstruct a hidden system history. He had signed the normal shift document. Martin stared at the page. I acknowledge operational notices every morning. That doesn't mean I knew which passenger was carrying the equipment. Rebecca answered before Celeste could. You knew the equipment required custody protection. Martin looked at her. That still doesn't remove security discretion. Heather nodded. No. But discretion doesn't cancel the custody protocol. Her answer closed one issue and opened another. If Martin had a separate security reason to override the custody instruction, he would need to identify it. He did not. Instead, he returned to Celeste's refusal. She challenged the inspection from the start. Celeste's phone began vibrating on the table. She glanced at the screen. Tessa. She stepped only a few feet away before answering. I could hear part of the conversation while I continued the recovery record. Her daughter was already in San Francisco. The Architecture Fellowship presentation had been moved later in the afternoon, but not enough to solve the problem. Celeste asked whether there was any chance of another delay. Tessa gave an answer I could not hear. Celeste closed her eyes briefly. I know what I promised. Heather looked toward the custody display. Then she looked at Celeste. If you leave now, we can't complete holder authentication. The validation session remains unresolved. Celeste covered the phone. How long? If everything matches, 20 minutes, maybe less. Celeste looked at the departure board on my second monitor. Her original flight was already showing final closure. She returned to the call. I'm staying until this is secure. A pause. I know. When the call ended, she set the phone face down. Martin had stopped talking. Heather inserted Alder Pacific's authorization key and started the holder challenge. Celeste entered the response herself. The profile loaded. Registered Custodian. Executive Authority. Celeste Morgan. Chief Executive Officer. Line Systems. Rebecca stared at the screen. Martin's posture changed almost immediately. Miss Morgan, if we had known, Celeste looked at him. You knew enough to check the custody instruction. That was all she said. Heather continued the verification. The seal was intact. The token signature matched. No unauthorized access had occurred. I called Central Operations. D. 16 Continuity. Physical custody verified. Holder authenticated. Begin staged release. The first group of departures moved from manual review to release pending. Martin looked at the board. So the operational issue is ending. The technical recovery is, I said. He did not answer. Then he stepped beside my console and pointed to the incident summary I had prepared. The first line read, "Security separation of registered validation equipment triggered custody safeguard." Martin read it twice. That makes it sound like security caused the entire disruption. That is the sequence. The passenger refused inspection. That can go in the security report. He tapped the screen. Change this to passenger refusal led to validation interruption. I looked at the custody manifest beside Heather. Then at the separation event. Then, at the green boarding authorization Rebecca had preserved. Those records did not support his wording. I'm leaving the operational cause as recorded. Martin stared at me for several seconds. I submitted the packet. Because the incident had crossed Alder Pacific's network impact threshold, the full version went automatically to Karen Ellis in security compliance. A few minutes later, Karen called. She was not asking about Celeste's title. She wanted Martin's credential review activity. Rebecca searched the local notation field while Karen remained on speaker. One phrase appeared repeatedly: priority presentation mismatch. Martin had used it on other passengers. Several had later been cleared with valid credentials. Karen asked for the comparison period to be expanded. The room had started with one equipment case. Now compliance was pulling a list of names. And Celeste Morgan was no longer the only passenger on it. Karen Ellis did not begin with Celeste Morgan. She began with the other passengers. Because my network impact packet had linked Martin Crowley's credential notation to the custody event, I was asked to sit in the compliance review as the operations custodian. Rebecca Shaw was there for the gate record. Heather Sloan joined for the technical sequence. Karen had pulled every use of priority presentation mismatch from the previous 6 months. 43 interventions appeared. Most ended with valid credentials. Karen did not sort the cases by race first. She sorted them by what security claimed had triggered the review. Several had no objective credential failure at all. One black attorney had been stopped after entering the premium lane with a corporate travel pass that scanned normally. A black software engineer had been reviewed because her laptop case was described as inconsistent with expected premium travel. Another passenger had been questioned after a gate employee wrote that his clothing did not appear consistent with the reservation class. Karen placed those cases beside a control group from the same gates and travel programs. The difference was difficult to ignore. Black travelers and other travelers of color were being selected far more often, even when their credentials later proved valid. Martin sat across the table. I never selected anyone because of race. Karen looked at the review sheet. I'm evaluating the decisions you recorded. She opened the current case. Celeste's boarding pass had validated. Her custody instruction had already been acknowledged by security. Martin had no documented credential failure before stopping her. The same problem appeared repeatedly in the older files. Suspicion came first. Objective evidence often came later, if it came at all. Karen removed Martin's passenger-facing credential review authority that afternoon. His access to local security annotations was disabled, while employee relations completed a separate hearing. Celeste did not ask to decide his punishment. She asked about the passengers whose records still carried unsupported security notes. That changed the review again. Alder Pacific examined each case individually. Where a notation had no documented policy basis, the passenger record received a correction rather than having the original entry silently deleted. Travelers who had documented expenses from missed connections or unnecessary secondary delays were offered reimbursement through the claims process. Martin's employment hearing finished several weeks later. The findings cited repeated misuse of discretionary credential review. It also cited inaccurate characterization of passenger conduct and failure to follow a custody instruction his unit had already acknowledged. Alder Pacific terminated his employment. The airline changed the tool that had allowed the pattern to grow. Priority presentation mismatch disappeared from the menu. Security staff could still initiate credential review. They now had to select an objective reason tied to policy. Identity mismatch, failed credential validation, prohibited device condition, documented custody exception, or another basis, requiring supervisor approval. Compliance also began sampling those decisions each month for demographic disparities. That should have been the end of my work on the incident. It was not. Line asked Alder Pacific for a joint technical debrief. 206 departures had entered manual review after one physical separation event. Celeste attended that meeting as CEO. I expected her team to defend the safeguard. Instead, she asked the first question. Why did one token affect that many departures? Line's engineers explained that the software could confirm separation immediately. It could not quickly distinguish an accidental custody break from a broader credential compromise. The safeguard had protected dispatch integrity. Its response had also been wider than necessary. Celeste approved a redesign. Future holder separation events would isolate only systems tied to the affected validation session. They would expand only if other indicators appeared. Nobody in the room treated that as an admission that Martin had been right. It was a separate responsibility. One bad decision at a gate had exposed two different weaknesses. Both organizations had something to correct. Celeste never recovered the flight she lost that morning. I knew, because I had watched her sit in the operations lounge after the network stabilized. Her laptop was open to a live stream from San Francisco. Tessa, her daughter, stood beside an architecture model. People moved quietly through the room behind her. Celeste had missed the front row. She caught the whole presentation. Weeks later, I carried the final operational attachment. I handed it to compliance. A mail cart sat by the records counter outside Karen's office. The sealed envelopes held correction notices, reimbursement decisions, and case findings. They were for passengers affected by unsupported interventions. Several rows down, I recognized Celeste Morgan's name. The top envelope was addressed to someone I had never met. That was the one the clerk picked up first.